The drifter, there were more stars overhead than he could ever remember seeing in the night sky before, but then again he couldn't remember much of anything since he'd left San Antonio. The thought of that comforted him and he smiled. He reached into his pack and pulled out a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey and he took a long swig straight from the bottle. He quickly returned it and continued his slow march down State Road 89A, at least he knew where he was going. Might not remember how he had managed to get this far, but he did have a destination in mind and that dogged determination carried him through despite his almost continual blackout. The alcohol kept grief and pain from completely breaking his fragile hold on reality. He couldn't allow himself to start to think. He absolutely had to keep his mind sedated to the point of total oblivion or taking another step would likely become impossible. Of course, no matter how much booze he drank he could never really erase the memory that was chasing him away from everything and everyone he'd ever known. He knew what he had to do. He'd known what he had to do for a long, long time, he just hadn't had the strength to do it. Now his drinking wasn't just a bad habit, it was no longer just some problem to be discussed with his loved ones, always reassuring them and himself that it wasn't so bad. He had repeated that lie over and over until now he was faced with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide from the truth. His drinking had to be stopped. He truly believed that it was also the only thing keeping him alive and moving toward this crazy intention. He had gone to rehab 3 separate times and over again he had picked up white chips at meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. Thinking how much better life would be if he would just stay sober. He'd gone to the front of the church during invitation many times and had had so many people pray over him, beseeching the heavens to remove this affliction that so easily took control of him and poisoned his soul so completely it was as if all human characteristics left him and a demonic monster took charge. He struggled to accept the blurry memories of so many horrible rage-filled nights he'd spent demanding something or another and often cruelly torturing someone he loved and blaming them for it all. He drained the last fifth of the bottle in a vain attempt to ward off the thought that quickly followed that admission of his nature. His family was better off now. No more would they be forced to suffer at the hands of a demented sadist who blamed them for all his own misdeeds. If you treated me better I wouldn't have had to cheat on you. If you weren't always complaining I wouldn't have to drink so much. I let you manage the money for a reason, you know how bad I am with it, so if we're broke it's your fault. Quit crying. I didn't hurt your arm. Come faster next time and I won't have to grab you like that. Shut up. Shut up. Shut up. Shut up. On and on the records played inside his mind, forcing him to relive all the misery he'd caused his wife and son, while they were alive. Now that they were gone from him forever, the realization that they were finally safe struck him like a bolt of lightning, and the alcohol mixed with the overpowering emotion made him stop and retch the bile substance of his stomach contents onto the highway roadside. He was shaking, still far too numb to shed a tear, but a fear had gripped him and beads of sweat were welling up on his forehead as the nausea continued to wash over him in great waves. Lord, please not yet. Let me get to Sedona and find a nice place to sit. Lord, please, help me, he pleaded with the desperation of a dying man. He fell to his knees and continued his prayer in silence even within himself, because in the face of his horror he was at a complete loss of words with which to beseech the Creator. God knew everything, and every single thought he had seemed worthless in the light of his truth. God had saved his wife and son from a life of pain and suffering and had chosen to leave him alive, now knowing the truth. How he longed to return to that ignorance. How he wished he had never seen himself in the light of the truth. Still nothing had changed yet. The truth couldn't save the lives of his wife and son, nor would sobriety. He had sworn off driving and immediately embarked on the type of bender only a true alcoholic could manifest and only a man protected by many angels could survive. He'd started out walking 4 or 5 sheets to the wind-down I-35 towards Austin, Texas. He'd woken up in the New Braunfels jail only to be released in the morning with a ticket which he'd promptly thrown down on the highway in complete disregard for his future life in society. Nothing mattered but his vampiric thirst for that pernicious nectar of the demon gods. A liquor store near the highway provided him with 2 liters of Kentucky Deluxe for less than $20. He'd stay drunk for 2
For Grandma Margaret the first have just gotten home from the longest of long 12 hours that somehow turned into 16 hours because of staffing issues nursing shifts. I am exhausted mentally and physically, and I feel filthy with sweat, tears, and many other things I should not be covered in. All I want to do right now is chop something into oblivion until I feel somewhat normal again. I want to not have to think for just a little while. When I unlock my apartment door, I am surprised to find Grandma Margaret sitting at the kitchen table. Smiling, as always. After a shower and a change of clothes, I realizes that exactly what I need to do is make Nefla soup for myself and Grandma. What is Nefla soup, you may ask? It is a German dumpling soup that you'll be hard-pressed to find in any diner outside of the Midwest. Those who eat it are picky about how it is made, and no two people make it exactly the same. Not only that, but it is a recipe that is impossible to make exactly the same every time that you make it. Grandma Mary taught me how to make it as a small girl. Long before junior high and shortly after I learned to read. It has always been our favorite meal to share. Starting with the vegetables, I carefully peels the potatoes, making sure that I cut off the skin, and only a small amount of potato. No conversation passes between the two of us. Grandma always knows when I needed a mental break at the end of the day and how most times I can't talk about what went so horribly wrong due to patient privacy. She never pushes me to talk about it. Instead, she sits at the table and watches as I goes through the motions of preparing our dish. A pound or so of potatoes later, I'm never too careful about the amounts that go into making Nefla soup, or the recipe. Nefla soup is not a dish of measurement, it is a dish of feelings. The amounts that go into it depend on what you're hungry for at the moment, what looks right, or what feels right. No recipe has ever been put on paper, just passed on from one generation to the next with wise words of, "Whenever it looks like enough, dear." Grandma always said that it was not a recipe meant to be shrunk or modified. It always makes a large amount, and any attempt at shrinking has been unsuccessful, although making it larger comes out perfectly every time. This works well when you are from the Midwest and are a firm believer in freezing the extra for a day when you don't want to make it from scratch. I chop the celery, carrots, and onions quickly as Margaret looks on from the table, nodding her approval occasionally. Once all of the vegetables are cooking in a lot of butter, yes, it's bad for you, but most comfort foods are, it's time to make the Nefla dough. My favorite part of making this meal, and also the most comforting. Eggs, flour, and a tiny bit of chicken broth get mixed together until everything is mixed together. The secret is to use only a certain amount of flour and add more chicken broth until it is right. Doing the reverse, adding set amounts of all three ingredients and adding more flour tends to make the dough taste just like you would think it would. Flour. Some people prefer chicken noodle soup, others like macaroni and cheese after long days. For me it is Nefla soup. Creating the dough is one of the most relaxing things I could think to do after a long day, and Grandma watches carefully as I knead the dough and rolls it into snakes. Only every once in a while does she gestures to add just a little more chicken broth. Dropping bits of dough into boiling chicken broth puts me into a trance. As I place the lid on the pot to boil for several minutes, my mind slips into the past. The bad melts away quickly, and memories of standing on a stool wearing Grandma's second-best apron make their way to the front of my mind. I remember the hem of the apron dragging on the floor at first, being so little I could barely see over the counter. Then I remember the awkward middle school years and unloading my boy and friend troubles over a bowl of Nefla dough. Lastly, I remember becoming an adult, and trying hard to make time in my busy life for Grandma's house at least once a week. Though, once work, friends, significant others, and my own children came into the picture, it seems that almost 2 would go by before I found myself back in her kitchen again. As I put the finishing touches on the soup and turn off the burner, the memories fade and I am back in my own apartment once again. Grandma says nothing, but she has always made my day better, just by being there. I dish a single bowl of soup, butter a piece of bread, because nothing goes with Nefla soup the way a buttered piece of bread does, and sit down at the table. Grandma Mary has been gone for 11 years now, and on the hardest days, after the worst shifts, I always miss her the most. The regrets become an inner monologue, before being spoken out loud. Did I spend enough time with her?